If your dizziness symptoms are triggered by things like walking around in the grocery store aisle like this, then this video is for you. This has to do with something called visually induced dizziness, which is sometimes called visual vertigo, which is a much different type of dizziness and vertigo than people experience from things like BPPV. Now, this is the part where it can get a little bit confusing because this condition can be induced by an initial acute spell of vertigo from something like vestibular neuritis or even BPPV. But the reason people have this problem is not because their inner ear is acting up, it's actually because their eyes are actually creating a lot of the problem. Our sense of balance is driven by the interaction between three senses, mainly your vestibular sense, your visual sense, and your proprioceptive sense, a lot of it being driven by the cervical spine. Your brain processes all these things together and makes a decision about what our bodies are doing in space. The system has a lot of built-in redundancy into it so that if one system goes down, the other systems can start to work harder in order to make up the difference. So if we lose aspects of our vestibular system, like when we get vestibular neuritis, then our brain has to recalibrate and has to put more resources towards either vision or proprioception in order to make our balance and equilibrium work out okay. This is not that much different than when if someone goes blind, then their hearing starts to become a little bit sharper. For a lot of people, if you lose your vestibular sense, then you're going to allocate a lot more resources towards your visual sense. Which is all well and good, but there are consequences for when our brain actually puts too much stock into our visual system instead of our other senses. It leads us to developing something called visual dependency, which means that our brain is way too focused on our vision and it's decreased our trust in our vestibular and our proprioceptive senses. This becomes important for discriminating when the person thinks that their body is moving versus when they observe something moving in the background. When people have normal sensory balance, the ability for you to determine whether this train is moving versus when you are moving is actually quite easy. But when you have visual dependency, that line starts to become blurred, and the fast movement of a train starts to create a nystagmus pattern in your eyes that feels pretty similar as when you are actually turning and spinning. Which this type of illusion is actually created when you're actually walking through the aisles of the grocery store and you start to see all this movement of all this stuff in the background and the lights overhead as you're starting to move through the store. We could actually test for this fairly easily by having a patient do a balance test, and we'll put a visual stimulus like these stripes and we'll put them in motion and compare their balance without the stripes versus the balance when the stripes are moving. But the good news is there are multiple ways that we could treat this. We could use vestibular rehabilitation to help the patient gain trust in the visual system. We could also use habituation therapies where we expose the patient to these optokinetic motions so that the brain starts to develop a tolerance for this movement so it doesn't affect them as much in the real world. But it's also important to remember that if you have an active vestibular issue going on, whether it's Meniere's or vestibular migraine, that we have to make sure that we treat that and reduce their flares before we do this. Otherwise, those flares are probably going to spin you back into this cycle again.